Giorcelli. Welcome, Michela. How are you doing?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm doing great.
Yeah, it's so great to have you here. I think you visited London School of Economics before, right? For a presentation last year?
Yes,
Okay, yeah, we met there.
yes.
I remember you presented a paper on productivity. It was really nice. And then we met, I think, at John's office like for a really short time. It's so nice to have you here now again.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Let me also introduce you to our audience. So, Michela Giorcelli is an applied microeconomist and an economic historian, and her research focuses on the managerial and technological drivers of productivity and innovation in the long run. And today, our main focus will be on productivity and the role of hard and soft technologies on productivity differences across firms and across countries. So, I think we have a really nice, a very exciting range of topics today, from the historical development of managerial practices in the 19th and 20th century, the effect of World War II, for example, and the export or diffusion of soft technologies across countries and across firms. And if we have time left, we will also go into kind of questions related to culture, norms, and gender. And at the end, we're gonna finalize with some intriguing, cheesy questions. But before all that, you have a book coming up called Professionals and Productivity: The Diffusion of Soft Technologies During and After World War II. First of all, congratulations. When is the book
Thank
coming
you.
up?
So I expect the book to be ready in approximately 1 year from now.
Oh, nice. You have a very short time left then.
Yes.
How is it like, to write a book? Can you tell us a bit about it? Because I know we're mostly focused on writing papers instead of maybe publishing books. So how is that experience? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so I think that writing books for economic historians is an heritage of history departments. Historians write books much more than economists. And usually, when there are a few papers on coherent historical period and set of topics, it's natural to having a book that put all these papers together under the same framework. So for me, I started working on the diffusion of managerial practices from the US to Europe. Then I started wondering why managerial practices diffused in the US first, and I wrote a couple of papers about it. And At that point, I started thinking of whether I could trace a history of management and try to understand how the concept of management first developed, while developed in the US before then Europe, even if the Industrial Revolution, we all know, started in Europe, in the UK specifically. And that's how the idea of the book came from.
So is it, in your experience, is it harder like to write a book? You have papers. I mean, it's based on that. But does the process take longer into like when you compare it to writing a paper?
I think it's different in the sense that the book focuses more on the narrative and the history that links all the paper together, and also gives more importance to anecdotal evidence or qualitative evidence rather than the papers that are very much focused on quantitative analysis. I have to admit that writing a book requires a completely different set of skills that writing the papers that I'm acquiring, and it definitely takes some time.
I understand. And how about, so what made you interested in these areas? Like, you work on these topics, and then we're going to talk about, the topics you mentioned as well. So, was there a specific person or an event that made you, follow this path, or like maybe a family member, or I don't know, someone from the faculty, like a faculty member?
Yes, so actually, my interest in Europe after World War II and the diffusion of knowledge and technology started through the memories of my grandfather. Because when I was a kid, he used to tell me that right after the war, he was working in this factory whose managers at some point left for a few months. They went to the US. And when they came back, they completely changed the way in which they were producing. And my grandfather used to tell me that they were able to produce double, working half of the time. And
Oh, I
so
see.
when I grew up, I started studying economics. I always wondered how it was possible and why these managers had to go all the way to the US in the 50s to come up with new production methods. Why couldn't they do themselves while working on the firm? And so it's how my interest in the Marshall Plan, the exchange of knowledge and technology between United States and Italy initially started.
That's very interesting. And I think that's a very important part, I think, the knowledge diffusion, because I mean, we talk about innovation most of the time, and we're going to have specific episodes on like innovation diffusion itself or management diffusion. Right now we're going to talk about it today because it's important that knowledge spillovers or diffusion, and it seems like it has a really huge impact on how firms like produce and even countries, I think. So
Yeah.
maybe we can start talking about, like, I mean, we talk about management a lot, but to be on the same page, how do you describe management?
So we can think about management as both the managerial practices, so the management system that a firm puts in place, and management people, so CEOs, top executives, and more in general, managerial talent that a firm acquire, and managers are those who are in charge of implementing managerial practices. We're not, especially today, we're not necessarily focusing on CEOs, but also on middle management, like middle managers, production supervisors that are in charge of implementing some specific managerial practices.
So it's mostly like different sections within a firm and other managers, and so those are the middle managers, right? Would a manager, like, from, let's say, since your also book is also about the historical aspect of management, would a manager from the early 20th century understand the same way we do today, or like how has that notion changed over time, or these practices change over time?
So, management at the beginning of the 20th century was still in its infancy. The first managerial organizational theories mostly aimed at maximizing workers' productivity. A notable example of this is Taylorism, that tried to minimize the worker movements in the factory in order to maximize output per employee. Notably, these principles were applied in the Ford factories for the production of cars, and it was estimated that by simply removing unnecessary workers' movement across the firm, the time to assemble a car was reduced from 12 hours to 2.5 hours. And so it actually allowed the car mass production to start. Later on, especially, so here we are at the beginning of the 20th centuries, in the next two decades, 1920s and 1930s, the discussion about management became broader, in the sense that some aspect of factory operation, interaction of the workers, interaction of team workers became predominant in the discussion. Some plants actually tried to change working condition and see whether workers' productivity change accordingly. But only with World War II, the US government started developing a bundle of practices that included the factory operation, production planning, and human resources management that became the core managerial principle taught in the US during World War II and then exported to Europe and Japan after World War II. And if we are thinking about this specific bundle of practices over time, so since World War II up to today, it has changed very little, despite enormous changes in the way in which we produce. So, what was thought to be good management during World War II, after World War II, is still thought to be good management today. The principle of the training within the industry method, which is the method based on factory operation, production planning, and the human resources management that was used during World War II, is still taught today, for instance.
I see. And also I think maybe what has changed the most, maybe the labor conditions, for example, like especially during the Second World War, like before and after, we see more kind of policies improving, like the working conditions, working hours, because in the 19th century, you can work really long hours in the United States, like for like 14 hours, 16 hours a day. And then those things also start changing. So in that sense,
Yes.
probably management also kind of adapt itself to such changes.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, during World War II, the first rules about safety in the workplace started being implemented. The goal was try to minimize accidents that workers could be exposed to in order to maintain the reduced labor force as productive as possible. But this became an important part of management system, and we can trace its origin back to World War II.
I see. And also in terms of because there is heterogeneity in terms of like firm sizes or firm experience. Some firms are bigger and maybe they have more experienced managers. So how are the management practices, different like between startups and large firms? And how do like financial capabilities like play a role in terms of hiring a better management team?
Definitely, management capabilities are very important, not only in terms of the implementation of specific practices, as we discussed, but also for select and retain better workers. However, differences in the implementation of managerial practices are huge and very persistent, even in very comparable firms and factories. So, even if we think about the very similar firms that produce very comparable products, we can still observe dramatic change both in productivity and implementation of managerial practices. Recent work by Chad Severson and Robert Calfee in the retailing sectors has shown how within the same brand, different stores have very different outcomes based on the managerial talent that they are able to acquire.
Wow.
So even
Even
within the
within.
same firm, different stores could have very different outcomes.
Oh, I see. Wow. I mean, I would expect at least like within firm, you would observe some homogenous kind of, I don't know, effective managerial kind
Yes,
of
because
practices,
like
right?
the high level managerial practices are definitely the same, but the way in which they are implemented in specific stores really depend by the people that
I
are
see.
in
That's
charge of it.
interesting. So then it looks like some people are consultants for management. I kind of feel like their role is really important then. I mean, even if you work for a company, just one company, let's say, if they have multiple stores, I mean, it's important to have that consultant so that, they go to these stores and observe these differences. It's really important to measure these differences in terms of like productivity, even if and the management practices. Then I think their role is really important. And also, so you also talked about the importance of World War II, that the government changed its kind of behavior maybe, or policies, or adopted different policies. Can you tell us a bit about that? What specifically happened after that time? Like what was going on in this period?
Yes, so World War II has traditionally been considered an extraordinary surge of growth by using Chandler's word, most in terms of the advancement in terms of science and technology. And this was definitely a very important part of what World War II did. The fact that the war was fought among the most advanced powers in the world really created a race between them in order to come up with innovations that could help countries to win. In this respect, the US was different from European countries and also to Japan, in the sense that exactly because the most advanced economies in the world were involved in the conflict. In the US, there was also the awareness that scientific advancement per se might not be enough to win the war. It was also important to coordinate and organizing productions. And so based on this, there was an increasing attention towards managerial practices. The US government organized more than a program to diffuse managerial practices for the biggest and largest US firms that were mostly work for the government, so got work contracts for the government. There was consulting services, so there were like government trainees that visited these plants, giving them suggestions in order to improve their practices, their productivity. But there was also creation of business education in order to let the middle manager, production supervisors know what was the good way of managing production. And the goal of all these interventions was to avoid any disruption caused by war and also try to make the new employees as productive as possible. Of course, the US had a larger fraction of men in working age who had to serve, they had to be replaced, and the government really want the new workers to be as productive as possible. So definitely, the specific setting of World War II determined a strong intervention of the government in promoting art technologies, but also in sponsoring soft technologies. And it was probably an initiative very hard to implement in peacetime. And an example is given by the US themselves. After the war, the US government was hoping that most of the programs that were implementing during the war could have been offered by private firms, not free as during the war, but by paying a fee. But given the very good results of these programs, there was a widespread consensus that a lot of firms would want to join these programs. However, in peacetime, the situation of US firms was changed. So, first of all, they had a very large export market, especially in Europe and in Japan. So, the drive of productivity became a little bit less important than during the war. But also, the firms start seeing with suspicion the intervention of the government in their own business. They didn't want that. And this is a very important
Hmm.
part of US economic history because at that point, the US decided to export these practices to Europe and Japan. And the lean production, the Toyota management system, definitely has its roots in the training within the industry program, which is exactly these managerial principles that the US exported to Japan right after the war.
Um, so did Toyota, for example, demand that, or was there kind of approach from the American side saying that we have this kind of management kind of technology or soft technology that we can have a kind of a collaboration or something? So how did that happen? Do
So
we
it was
know?
mostly from the American side, and in particular, a few promoters of the management program during World War II were very upset by the lack of interest in their own initiatives after the war. And so some of them moved to Japan and, in attempt to help the country recover from the war, offer training programs for Japanese managers. And these practices also had some specific characteristics like the prioritization of order by delivery date, the reduction of inventory that met very well the constraint the Japanese firms were faced at the time. And so most of these principles complemented the way of Japanese production very well.
I see. So, and also, I think those type of maybe practices, like if you, for example, if you're two different people, then maybe it might be hard to work together. But if you know how your methodology, is, to when you work, then maybe things are going to go maybe even more smooth. Maybe in that sense, it also helped maybe like to kind of export that technology, that soft technology to Japan, and then they probably had maybe even more trade afterwards.
Yes, yes, absolutely. The fact that there are codified practices that could be exported and could also be adapted to different production methods or different industry is very important in
I
helping the
see.
diffusion of them.
Yeah, and I'm actually surprised because I wouldn't think that in terms of management practices, like government was very much involved in the United States, like to create that kind of boost, and that's interesting because I was going to ask you like if that change in terms of like these practices did it happen naturally or with an intervention? And it looks like the government played a very important role in that sense, so that maybe gives us a
Yes,
message for some other developing economies that this is an area that they can be involved with.
yes, absolutely. So definitely there was a private initiative in the 20s, in the 30s, in order to understand how some specific practice could affect a firm performance. A notable example example of this is represented by the Hawthorne experiment. There were different plants the Hawthorne factory that tried to test the implementation of different practices and see how the performance of the worker changed based on this. So the idea of quantification, of quantifying the importance of this intervention was very important at the time. Unfortunately, there were some shortcomings in how data were collected. For instance, the pre-experiment, quote, quote, experiment performance were recorded on Friday, and the post-experiment performance were recorded on Mondays. And we all know that workers on Friday are tired and probably less productive than on Monday, despite the implementation of specific practices. So some of results were probably biased by issues in obtaining consistent measure of workers' performance. What the US during the war did was putting together these different principles and transferring to firms not just specific practices, but the bundle of practices altogether, which is also what is done today in business training programs in developing countries, for instance.
So, is this the American way of business? So, what do you mean by that in that book?
So, in the book, by the American way of doing business, I mean the importance of soft technologies in increasing productivity and the complementarities between soft and hard technologies that after the war were distinctive of US firms. So, what the book will argue is that World War II not only spurred technological and scientific advancement, but also created and diffused managerial practices. And these practices put receiving firms on a higher growth path that lasts for at least a decade after the war, but also was diffused in Europe and Japan after the war, creating a revolution in the management system in Western world.
And was that revolution good? How about the quantitative evidence?
So, if we think about the macro level, definitely after World War II, there was a convergence in productivity between Europe, Western Europe, and Japan, and the US. The gap, before answering your question, I would like to underscore that the gap in productivity between US and European firms was definitely widened by World War II, but was not caused by World War II. So in the 30s, there was already an increasing gap in productivity between plants in the US and plants in Europe, mostly because the US were already investing in understanding the importance of management, while European firms, European managers mostly neglected the role of management. So definitely this was before the war. The gap increased after the war when the US started so the US started giving money, giving economic and financial aid to Europe with the Marshall Plan in 1948. And in terms of recovery, in terms of increase of GDP, European countries started doing pretty well by 1950. However, there was an increasing productivity gap between firms. So even the economic recovery after the war was not able to change this trend. That's why the US started wondering whether management could be a problem in European firms. And I even read some quotes arguing that poor management practices implemented in European firms was a real problem of Europe, much worse than the damages caused by bombing and World War II destruction. So we can think that this is, of course, an extreme statement made by people who wanted to export managerial practices. But I think it's also interesting because it explains how the US, how US managers looked at managerial practices back then relative to Europe. If we want to focus more at the micro levels, looking at what happened to the firms whose managers went to the US, like the universe of firms similar to the one in which my grandfather used to work, the increase in performance of plants that send their managers in the US relative to comparable firms that eventually couldn't send their managers in the US is pretty striking. The sense that there is an increase in production, in productivity, not only upon visiting US firms, but also for 15 years after. And at least in the Italian context, firms that were involved in this exchange were mostly small and medium sized firms. So, pretty different from the very large work contractors that mostly benefit from government consulting services during the war. I think its interest is fascinating, at least from my point of view, try to understand why it was the case. So, can we really believe that if Italian managers traveled to the US, spent 3 months at US firms, then came back, they learned so much that their firms continue to perform better than comparable firms for 15 years? And indeed, the answer is yes and no. There were some direct effects of learning about managerial practices in terms of production, organization of the production, in terms of human resources management, but there were also amplification effects in the sense that once these firms got better, they were able to have more, invest more, get more loans from the banks. We can think the small and medium-sized firm, especially in Italy in the 50s, could have had serious budget constraint, resource constraint. So in a way, once constraint on the managerial structure became less binding, also some other financial constraint became less binding accordingly. And also firms tend to become more professional. So some of them move from being family owned to become professionally managed. That, of course, was a big change. They continue to hire more managers over time. And so, in this way, the initial influx of managerial practices also creates some conditions that allow these firms to continue to improve on their own, even when the US aid to Europe ended.
That's interesting. I think it was good to kind of differentiate the direct and in the indirect effect. That also brings me to the discussion of the effects of culture or institutions, like within a country, because I'm thinking if we exported that, let's say, that business knowledge to all countries, would we have the same effect in all countries, or like what are the complementary institutions that would facilitate um, the effect of these managerial practices? What do you think about that?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting question, and definitely it's something that policymakers back in the 50s started wondering. Can the managerial
Maybe.
practices develop for big US firms just being exported, adapted to Italian firms, French firms, German firms, Japanese firms, and work very well there? I think that the principle of the training within the industry, we are very specific on the one end, but on the other end, we're also flexible and could be adapted to the specific production situation of a firm. We can think that some practices like prioritizing own orders based on delivery deadline could be applied to both small and large firms. At the same time, implementing safety condition for the workers or regular maintenance of the machine is something important both in large and small firms. Same thing in terms of team cooperation, communication between managers and workers. One of the important principles developed during the war was that managers had to listen to their workers because sometimes the guys who did the job knew much more about specific issues in production, for instance, than the CEO. And so I
Right.
think that these are more general principles that can be adapted to different firm situations.
I see. Yeah. And also, what strikes you the most? I mean, when you do all these research and all these really nice papers, after you produce those papers, and you have a book coming up. So, what strikes you the most in these research areas? Was there a kind of a moment or a fact where you kind of were shocked when you learned about, or surprised, or is there a kind of a, I don't know. Maybe you also had a misconception about something, and then after you dig, further, like you notice that, oh, actually, this was wrong, like all along. uh, is there such a moment, like in your academic career?
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. I think it also relate to your previous question in the sense that when I first approach this exchange of managerial knowledge, but also technology between the US and Italy, my idea was that technology, like receiving brand new machinery from the US, would have an enormous effect on firm production, while I was a little bit more skeptical in terms of management. At the end, some of the principles that were taught to firms were not very sophisticated. We're very basic concept of performing some routine jobs. And so I was very surprised to find that it was the opposite, like the transfer of capital had not a very large and pretty short-lived effect on firm outcomes, while the effect of management were very large and very persistent over time. And so
I see
this
that.
yeah, this made me wonder why it was the case. So definitely, in terms of like the sake of the paper, like documenting the mechanisms better, but also try to think about the complementarities between hard and soft technologies, like giving capital without proper knowledge on how to use it doesn't produce long-lasting results, or maybe given firms capital that is too advanced for their technological level, workforce level, or simply because the scale of production is very different. Like the capital that could be good for large US firms may not be as good for small Italian factories, while management can definitely be more adapted to different firm situations. And in general, this skepticism about the importance of management is something that I get to discuss with colleagues pretty often. There is always this
Ah,
idea that the management practices are simple. If they are so simple, why don't all firms
no.
implement them? And but yes, the answer is no.
It's not simple at all. I mean, even
It's
if
not
you
that simple. Yes, exactly.
exactly. I mean, even just think about a research project. You have, say, a few RAs and then like a few co-authors, and then even within that team, sometimes if there might be miscommunications, there might be problems. Like, how are you going to do the like labor division? This is who's going to do what? Do you talk about those? Even the management of a research project is by itself hard, and I cannot think of a firm with like 30, 50, like 1,000 workers, and then they have to implement all those kinds of stuff because there's so many questions like coming up. So it's a
Yeah,
very
exactly.
important area, I would say. And how about, maybe this is an additional kind of question, but is there any differences in terms of gender when it comes to managerial practices?
Yes, there is, and in particular, there is a fascinating paper by Francesca Truffa and co-author that exactly looks at the differences in career outcomes of MBA's peers. And what they find is that for women, it is much easier to have a career progression when they join firms whose managers are women. And this is mostly due to the implementation of family friendly practices. For instance, longer maternity leave or longer flexibility in case of pregnancy that tend to be implemented less in firms that remain male dominated.
Yeah, I see. And also we have After I asked the question, I remembered my own paper. So we have with Richard Hornbeck, Anders Humlo, and Martin Rodenberg, we were working on a project about the 19th century women entrepreneurs, and we basically identified women business owners from the census of manufacturers, and we were comparing men and women entrepreneurs. And one of the things that was really striking and important, I think, like we mostly, for example, like spend time on the effects of having more women in the labor market, but having them as entrepreneurs or business owners or even as managers can be important because they can drive even more like women into the labor force. For example, if the business is owned by a woman, they also hire even more women and they pay higher wages. And I think that's a really important kind of aspect of it. Like in addition to having those rights that you mentioned, there are also, I think, such important implications of when there are more women in the labor force and at the same time in the managerial positions.
Yes, yes, yes. And there is also another work by Marianne Bertrand and Cotter that shows how the labor market outcomes of MBA's graduates tend to be pretty similar between men and women right after graduation. And most of the divergence started happening with family decision made by women, while of course there is no similar effect, not comparable effect for men.
Yeah, and also you also have you have really interesting papers on different topics. But one thing, maybe since we talk about gender, maybe we can go into STEM a little bit. So you have scientific education and innovation from technical diplomas to university STEM degrees. That's the title of the paper. One thing we can discuss is we observe less women in STEM degrees.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so in this paper, actually, most of the analysis we perform is based on men because so the data we use in the paper goes from 1958 to 1973. At the time, most of both high school and college STEM education was male dominated. So we really had to focus the analysis only on men because there were not enough women in the sample. Over time, the situation has improved a little bit, but even if it's now less pronounced in terms of education choices, as you mentioned, we can still see that in terms of innovation, there is less participation of women. So, for instance, if you look at patents that have been granted in Italy since the late 80s to today, the number of women that submit application for patents is much lower than men. And I think this is a striking result because it remains almost unchanged if we control for the industry, the sectors in which men and women work, and also if we control for firms. So even a man and a woman, even if they work in the same firm, they can have different patenting outcomes. And this is mostly on the extensive margin, so the submission of an application. If we look how many of the patents that are submitted are eventually granted, then we do not observe differences between men and women. So it looks like that there are some barriers to entry into the innovation to women, but once they're able to overcome these differences, the acceptance rate of patents submitted as well as the quality of the patent is really comparable between men and women.
That's good to hear, at least. um, I would love to actually talk more about these topics, but let's finalize with one more question, the research part. So there are PhD students listening to us, PhD candidates, early academic career people. So what are the gaps in the literature that you would kind of say that, these are the areas that maybe you're working on or maybe others should work on? Can you tell us a bit, about these gaps in the literature and what you're currently working on, so that maybe people might have an idea and then they might want to follow and take a look at these topics and come up with research questions?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that one big open question in the management slash productivity literature is why differences in management and productivity can persist. So as today, there is pretty high numbers of paper that shows that once managerial practices are implemented, there are improvements in firm outcomes. Still, if we look at the distribution of managerial talent and of productivity, there are enormous differences. So even if we focus on firms that produce very concrete, very homogeneous products, I was thinking about concrete, for instance, we can see that the most productive firm is twice as productive as the least productive firm. And this is for the US. If we pick other countries like India or China, for instance, the differences are even big. We're talking about ratio 4 to 1, 5 to 1. So try to understand why, even in the US, that is high competitive market, these differences could persist. I think it's important, and I can speak for my research when I try to measure spillovers effect. I always find the spillovers effect are very limited following the diffusion of managerial practices. So there could be different explanation for this. It could be that for firms it's not that easy, despite like the misconception that we discussed before. It may be that for firms it's not easy to adopt managerial practices if they didn't get a specific training. It could be that firms may underestimate the importance of management, even if they look at other firms doing much better. It could be hard to understand why they're doing better and narrow it down to the implementation of specific practices, or it could be related to competition. Maybe not implementing some practices could be an optimal response to the market condition that firms or some specific firms are facing. So I think that is definitely an important area that deserve much more research.
That's good to know. And then I hope our listeners took notes. And then if they want to work on those topics, they can definitely also look at your papers. So maybe let's do a few more, intriguing, cheesy questions, and then let's finalize this episode. So we talked a lot about management and those practices, but how is your, like Michela Giorcelli's management of, work, life, time? How is that going?
I would probably need a training trip to the US during World War II, but it has improved over time.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, how is your production function? Like, I mean, to produce papers or books, I asked that
A
like
lot
to
of labor,
a lot of
a lot
labor.
of hell.
If you have other questions that I really wonder about you, since you also work on economic history. So, for example, if you could have dinner with any historical figure, like who would it be, and why would you, and what would you ask them, or what would you talk about?
So I would love to have dinner with the Greek philosopher Socrates and ask
Oh,
and discuss about the origin of philosophy, and in particular is teaching attitude and his teaching values. The idea that knowledge is inside people, and a good instructor, a good teacher should be able to take this knowledge out of the students. That would
that's
be a
interesting.
dinner
Yeah.
conversation that I would love to have.
Yeah, he would ask you questions probably to come out like, where do you think, philosophy is? Anyway,
Exactly, exactly.
yeah. And maybe one more practical question. So, what do you think your, for example, like biggest challenge in your role or in a project now or in the past? And then how did you, or are tackling that problem? This is also kind of
So
like a problem solving kind of thing. So if you had such a thing, maybe we could, people also, or we could benefit
yeah, so
from. Yeah.
there are a lot of examples. Research is full of highs and lows, and I think this is true for everyone. For me, a very difficult moment was actually when I started the data collection for my dissertation. So I came up with a proposal that my advisors liked, and so I traveled to Italy to visit historical archives and collect the data. And it was my first experience at the archive. I tried to do my own work. I tried to find what was in the archives. We're talking about 10 years ago. The IT revolution in Italy was still in its infancy, let's put this way. So there were not that many information online on what I could find in the archives. Most of my emails were unanswered. And so I decided to took a plane, go to Rome, showed up at the archives. And the in-person interaction went definitely better. And so I could start looking for what I wanted. And I started receiving all these folders I was hoping, the data that I was looking for. And I spent the first 2 weeks there, and it was an absolute nightmare in the sense that I found a lot of material that was completely unrelated to what I want to study. No data. And sometimes I was looking about Italy after World War II. I found documents going back to the pre-unitary Italy that were in the folder about World War II. So I was very confused, and definitely
Probably
no
very
one has ever
painful.
looked at that folder since at least 80 years. So it was a very depressing moment. I started thinking about, okay, what if I can find the data? All my dissertation project would collapse. And then I didn't give up, and with a lot of time and also a lot of luck, I was finally able to find the folders that contained the information I needed. And so I could collect the data, and definitely my dissertation survived. But
Yeah, it
it was
must
it
be.
was a very tough moment, also
Yeah.
because I have no interest, and also people working in the archives didn't have a clear understanding of what I could find there. So given how depressed I was at the time, they told me, okay, you can stay here how many all the hours you want. You can come here at 9 a.m., stay until 7 p.m., do whatever you want, but we cannot give you more help than this.
Oh, I see. Oh my God. I mean, at the end, everything turned out to be fine, but it's really hard to go through such kind of. I mean, I think probably every PhD student maybe is going through such depressive moments, and I'm so glad that
Oh,
you just
yes.
could
And
come
it
out
was
of
just
that.
one of many. So
I
I
see.
just had to pick one, but we could have the entire podcasting about depressing moments in
I think
academic
so.
life.
I agree 100%. Thank you very much, Michele. It was so nice to have a chat with you about your research, about your book, and I hope our listeners also enjoyed the talk. If they have any questions or comments, they can email us through at lscpodcast@gmail.com or through Twitter or X at @poid_cast. See you in the next episode.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.